a phone conversation was held between President Putin and President Trump. It lasted over 2 hours. And at the end of it, a very partial ceasefire was declared. It was Putin agreed to a ceasefire that would cover attacks on each side's energy facilities, airstrikes on each side's energy facilities. And apparently he implemented it immediately. He ordered the Gerasimov, the commander, the head uh, of the Russian military, to cease all attacks on energy facilities. And according to the Ministry of Defense, there were actually drones in the air that were going, on course to strike an energy facility within Ukraine, and the Russians shot down their own drones in order to comply with this ceasefire request from the president. Now, again, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, the Ukrainians, several hours after this ceasefire proposal, because I guess the Ukrainians hadn't agreed to it, we have to say it's a proposal in their case, sent a number of drones. Let's see how many, I don't know actually the number, but they struck an oil transshipment facility in the Krasnodar region. Now, this was connected to a pipeline that feeds into the Caspian Consortium. I guess it's called the Caspian Petroleum Consortium, which is actually a multinational consortium. Russia's part of it, but the U.S. is too, and which is kind of an indirect attack on the U.S. Earlier, they had directly attacked a pipeline that was where the U.S. clearly had a certain amount of ownership, or a U.S. company did. And that raised some eyebrows. Now they've done this. So it seems it's certainly not a friendly gesture, let's put it that way, on the part of the Ukrainians. So, but anyway, going back to the conversation, we had, there was this one agreement, which was something, touted by Trump afterwards, the agreement on the energy facility airstrikes. But then also there was a promise on the part of Putin, to maintain free passage of commercial vessels in the Black Sea. Now, my understanding is that that's actually been going on, so it doesn't really change anything. It maybe just formalizes what was implicit, previously. And then as far as the energy airstrikes, it is, you could describe it as a concession, or at least a gesture, which was not totally meaningless on the part of the Russians, but it was a very minor gesture because, though, again, if we believe the Russian Ministry of Defense, they did actually cancel an operation. More than that, they shot down their own drones. Often the Russians will go for maybe a month without striking their energy facilities in Ukraine. So, maybe they had this one strike planned, or actually had started, but it was a fairly minor one, and maybe they didn't have another one for another month. So it was something, a very, very minor concession, more of a gesture. But, again, gestures are important on the part of Russia. But he didn't, on all the major issues that where the Russians have repeated again and again, the matters that really concern them, such as, actually weapon supplies to Ukraine, the things that Trump, not Trump, but rather Putin brought up in his statement following that ceasefire announcement, the original ceasefire announcement several days ago. He pointed to the need to stop weapon supplies to Ukraine, actually to stop training and have a very, he asked the question rhetorically, how are we going to monitor this? Clearly they have to have some sort of monitoring regime that has to be worked out in detail. All those things, he didn't budge on any of those. And of course, the larger questions of neutrality and so on, there's no sign that he budged. Interestingly, it seems like Trump anyway seemed to, kind of accept the Russian position on actually on weapon supplies. He at least suggested. Now, of course, they have weapon supplies to Ukraine from the U.S. have resumed, but he seemed to imply that maybe that was something they can reconsider. This. So anyway, you can say there wasn't anything really very significant that came out of it in substantive terms, but it was. There were gestures involved, which they may be mainly symbolic, but that can be important. That's the first step. Maybe that's where you begin. Again, I think it needs to be emphasized that real negotiations have not begun. A couple of telephone conversations do not equal negotiations. You do actually have to put together teams and start working out the details. This is everything, the ceasefire, pretty much all of it has been kind of taken place on the level of rhetoric, and we have to start, we have to get down to the nitty gritty, and you do that actually with negotiation teams, and apparently both the Russians and the Americans are putting together those teams, and then we'll see what happens. If there's going to be real progress, it'll be made through real negotiations with teams sitting down together at the table and just hashing out all the details.
It's strange because where's Ukraine in all this? It seems like Ukraine is kind of sidelined. It's like,
clearly.
So, but what does that mean? It's like we agreed to a ceasefire, but technically we're not involved, supposed to be part of this conflict. But obviously, what we're doing is just stating that this is our conflict, this is our proxy. But if we are getting better relations with Russia and Trump seems to be enjoy working with Putin more than Zelensky. It seems like our relationship with Russia is getting better and better, where our relationship with the Ukraine-Kiev regime is plummeting. But they're our proxy. So what does that mean? Well, could we lose control of our proxy? Could we, will they abide to, we agreed to the ceasefire with Russia, but you said Putin said immediately, okay, we'll stop the energy infrastructure. Ukraine's not going to abide by it, right? They don't.
Yeah, well, they actually launched an attack last night.
Right, on a joint consortium, you said, between that included the U.S. as well as Russia and other countries. So, where do you see this going? Where does Ukraine play out in all this? Do you think that they will just go completely rogue? I mean, obviously, they probably have to be furious with the United States, right?
Yeah. Well, the Ukrainians have been defiant. Zelensky in particular. There was some hope. I think a number of people thought that after that meeting in Jeddah, between the Ukrainians and the Americans, after which this ceasefire announcement was made, that because in that, the readout after that meeting, there wasn't any mention of the usual Ukrainian requirements. And there was actually one statement in there where, this is a sort of an aside, but it really is kind of funny. He said that the Ukrainians said that it was, in the readout, it said that the Ukrainians, regard European involvement very important to the process. But it just was the Ukrainians. Obviously, the Americans didn't think so. But there wasn't any mention of all those other, matters, the NATO membership and all those things that territorial integrity, the kind of things that Ukraine has always been emphasizing is absolutely necessary. And so there was some hope that maybe they had quietly agreed to concede on those grounds. But it's clear since then, and especially now, that they haven't. Zelensky has made all those demands. He's repeated them again and again, since that meeting. And I believe he did it again today. The Ukrainians are adamant. They're not budging. And they clearly do not want to cooperate with the terms of any agreement, I think that could be reached between the U.S. and Russia. So really the only thing that the Americans can do, and it's real, is cut off the flow of arms. Now they did that, but it was just for a couple of days earlier, right? And maybe a few days, but they have to be serious about it. I mean, I don't know why they resumed it, after just this verbal assurance on the ceasefire. It seems like that was a mistake on the part of the Americans, in my opinion. But if they really want Ukraine to agree to this, the only way they can make them do that is by really turning the screws on them. And of course, the Americans can do that. They have enormous leverage over the Ukrainians. But it's still not clear that the Ukrainians would actually cave in on these. Again, Russia is not Russia, but rather Europe has been constantly repeating and very loudly, that we can take over. This now is our fight. Don't worry, Ukraine, we have your back. And the Ukrainians have, to some extent, echoed that. Now, I think we've discussed this earlier, that's all fantasy. But these people live in a fantasy world, and maybe that's what they really do. So even if the U.S. applies leverage, I don't know that you're going to get Ukraine to make any significant concessions. I think the wiser thing, if the Americans just want to get out of this war, and I think Trump actually really does, and some other people, important people around him, really do. The thing is there, it's going to have to be a unilateral decision on the part of the U.S. It's just like, if you can't get the Ukrainians to go along, well, you just leave and say, okay, Europeans, you guys, you're so eager, you believe you can do this, you do it. It's your affair. Anyway, this war is happening in Europe. It's not happening over here. It's your problem. And maybe that's what will happen. I think that's the only thing that we can really hope for. Again and again, I've said, I don't think that a real deal, though that would be best. It would be best for Russia, for everybody concerned, if a real deal was negotiated, that actually establish a new security architecture for Europe. That's what the Russians were looking for. That would be the best for everybody concerned. But I'm afraid that just can't happen. And part of the problem, of course, is the biggest part of the problem is probably Ukraine. So the next best thing is for the U.S. to walk away from this. And that will bring the war to a faster end. It could actually, rather than being a couple more years, who knows, it could be just a matter of months. I don't think that the Ukrainians really could hold out very long without the Americans.
Do the EU, do the European countries have any cards to play? There's talk of them sending troops. It keeps on being floated around and it keeps on getting shot down. But then I heard something about, 10,000 British troops going to be sent over to Ukraine.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if is there anything substantive there? Or is this just all bluster?
Well, I think it's basically bluster, because they keep on talking about that, or even implying that maybe they'll just send in the troops even absent a ceasefire. Usually it's predicated on a ceasefire. We get a ceasefire, then our troops are going to go in. But this is actually a way of, I don't know if it's intentional or not, if it's just an intentional effort to sabotage negotiations, or it's just stupidity. It's hard to say with the Europeans. But this promise this constantly repeated promise that we are going to send in troops as soon as there's a ceasefire provides the Russians with a huge disincentive, right? They say, well, if that's what's going to happen the moment we have a ceasefire, we're not doing this, because then we can't accept that, and we'll strike them. The whole thing will escalate. Things will get much worse. But I don't know how real these promises are. Because usually there's a condition attached to this promise to send European troops into Ukraine. And that is that, of course, if they, this is to provide a security guarantee to the Ukrainians, but we need our own security guarantee from the Americans. So the Americans have to back us up, because it's an admission of their own weakness. And the Americans again and again have said, no, we're not doing that. And I really don't think that they're going to get that from the Trump administration. So it's mostly hot air, but it's very dangerous hot air, and it's hot air that is making negotiations less and less real, substantive, ultimately successful negotiations less and less likely.
So it's kind of what you're predicting is that relations between the United States and Russia will improve, and we will agree on different bilateral agreements and, maybe some type of reset, warming of relations. But we won't be able to necessarily control Ukraine. We may, if Ukraine doesn't abide by the ceasefire or want to engage in some type of negotiated settlement, then we will probably just walk away. We'll say, okay, no more arms. Maybe we cut off Starlink, no more aid at all. And then this is going to put huge pressure on the European countries to step up because they've been voicing all this, the sentiment said, don't worry, we got your back, Ukraine, we got your back. Now Zelensky's like, okay, well, here's your time to step up because the Americans have left, and we'll see if they step up. And most likely you think they won't. They'll end up being back down, and that'll be the end of their political careers probably as well, because they've just put all this talk into it. And then when it actually comes to say, can you walk the walk? They're likely not going to walk the walk, or maybe they will. Maybe they will try, and then that will also definitely be the end of their political career at that stage.
Yeah, they really can't. They just don't have the means. They lack they don't have the weapons. They don't have the military industries. This is really just talk. Now there's some idea. There's this proposal made by von der Leyen that they're going to make $800 billion or more, or not dollars, but rather euros of credit available to support defense industries throughout Europe. Again, it's credit, it's loans, and these are countries that are not in very good fiscal shape. So, again, none of this looks realistic. It just seems to be talk, and I don't think you. And there really is an absence of support, and there are real differences within Europe too. We have the Brits are always eager to do anything, to take any kind of hostile action against Russia. And so are the Baltics, the Baltic states. But if you see real divisions, the Italians are very reluctant to go. And, so far the Germans have said that they don't want to, but now we're getting the new chancellor, and we'll see. He's made decisions within Germany to actually take off the debt brake that Germany had. Germany was a very, fiscally conservative country. And that's something that grew out of the Weimar experience, the hyperinflation. He said, never again. We've got to be very, very careful. We can't have, accumulate these huge debts. But so that's been sort of a real taboo, or you could say, or a red line within Germany. It's okay, we have to keep our debt under control. Now it's already expanded significantly, but it's still much less than other developed countries and other countries in Europe. But he wants to take the brakes off specifically for military industry and infrastructure. Again, they're talking about indebtedness. That's the way they're going to go about it. I don't see that they have the means to do it. Certainly in the short or medium term, potentially theoretically in the long run they could do it. But I have my doubts about that in any case. And in the long run, the war will be over. So what can they do?
Right. Well, if they want to go down that route, the first thing they need to do is to get cheap energy again, right? You're just going to start making tanks at 4 times the price because you don't have the energy to do it. So there's talks about the U.S. and Russia repairing the Nord Stream pipeline. Do you think if they do that, will Germany say like, okay, give us some of that cheap gas again? Or have they put themselves in a corner like, no, we're on this moral hill?
We can't have cheap gas. We're only in favor of expensive gas.
Right. And to continue to deindustrialize. It's astonishing. This suicide that they're committing here and throughout Europe. So what is that happening? Do you know anything about that Nord Stream pipeline repair?
Well, it's not happening, but there's been some talk about it. That's all. It's just talk, and nothing official. I think it's all kind of, it's maybe more than rumor, but not a whole lot more than that. Well, one thing is there are encouraging signs clearly, between the Russian and U.S. leadership. So clearly relations are improving. And we have pulled back from the precipice. Biden took us right up there to the edge with his continual escalations, his continued, unrelenting hostility. And that has ended, and that's very encouraging, but still there are, I think earlier I said there were 24,311 sanctions. I saw another figure just the other day of 29,000 sanctions on Russia. And
nice.
So it's the most sanctioned country in the world. and in fact, that number has not decreased under Trump. In fact, it has increased. He let some things go forward. So we really have not. It's what we've seen so far is symbolic, which doesn't mean that I don't say that doesn't, because it's symbolic, it's just meaningless. I think it is quite meaningful, but nothing substantive. And I do have my concerns about whether or not we will reach make these substantive gains. I think I mentioned earlier that that those negotiations that were held between the U.S. team and the Russian team over the question of like embassy restaffing really didn't make any significant progress. And the Russians complained that there was the same old faces. In other words, they were looking at the Biden Blinken team across the table. And these people had instructions from above, okay, you're supposed to do this, but they can drag their feet. That's a lot of what the deep state is about. You can have a new, there's a new guy in charge at the top. He issues the commands, but they don't necessarily get implemented. Or, by the time the command travels through all these offices, it's unrecognizable. Or, it's just not the same thing. That it doesn't reflect the intentions of the leadership. So, that's the thing. It's like, who are the people that are going to make up these teams? And are they really committed to making significant progress? We'll see. That's something that's not, it's not exciting like a telephone call, but that's where the real progress is made. And so I still have my concerns about this, that potentially, I don't think we won't have a negotiated settlement to the war. I'm afraid that that's not going to happen. But potentially there are all kinds of other things we can do. I mean, there are other areas of where the U.S. and Russia can cooperate, in economic spheres and other spheres as well. But still, we could at least restaff the embassies and get ambassadors appointed and all that kind of thing. That's supposed to happen, but it still hasn't happened. And maybe it will, but we still haven't seen the real progress. And so I do have my doubts. I don't doubt, again, the intentions of Trump, but I do have my concerns about his ability to actually translate his intentions into real changes, in the real world.
Okay, so you're telling us to temper expectations.
Yeah,
cautiously optimistic.
Yeah, I say cautiously. Yeah.
It's hard not to feel optimistic because you hear statements. I believe Peskov made some comment just like the world is a much safer place now after that phone call, something like that. And I believe Witkoff called the phone call. I believe he said epic and transformative,
right?
Something like this. So it's like, you using words like that, I'm like, whoa, epic. That's a good one, right?
I know. I noticed that too. I think that's excessive. And to be honest, so the Russians are much more cautious and I think more realistic about this. Again, Witkoff is, maybe he really is a good negotiator, a good emissary for Trump, but he has virtually no, prior to this administration, prior to his appointment, he had zero experience in diplomacy. And, one thing that maybe we can use this as a segue, he had his initial success in the Middle East in brokering the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, but that has fallen apart. And I, you can't put the blame entirely on him, but the fact is that, after brokering that ceasefire, which actually described this two-phase process, he agreed to the change of terms. It's just essentially he started reflecting the Israeli position. And the Israelis didn't, because Netanyahu clearly never wanted to do that second phase. So he began to just say, to approach Hamas and say, well, let's just get an extension of the first phase, let's forget the second phase for now. And that was, You have to, trust is so important, let's say, in diplomacy. It is, trust has to be built up over time. And when you make promises, you really have to keep them. And he broke his promise in essence right there. And I think that's part of the reason that we're in such a fix right now in Palestine and in the greater Middle East.